The rain had been falling over Seattle since late afternoon, thin at first and then steady, painting the windows of Daniel Harper's apartment with silver lines that blurred the city lights beyond, and he sat alone on the couch with a gray blanket over his legs, scrolling through Netflix without really seeing the titles, letting the soft glow of the screen fill the room because silence had become too loud in the 2 years since his divorce, and even though he had learned how to cook for one, clean for one, and fall asleep without another heartbeat beside him, night still pressed against him in ways he never admitted out loud. He finally chose a romantic drama, something about second chances, and pressed play, telling himself it was just background noise. But as the opening music swelled, he felt that familiar ache in his chest, the kind that comes when memories rise without warning, memories of laughter in the kitchen, whispered talks after midnight, and the slow, painful drift that followed when love turned quiet and careful and then distant. He rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the heaviness, when he heard soft footsteps in the hallway, light but certain, and then a gentle voice broke through the room, "Dad," and Daniel turned to see his 16-year-old son Ethan standing there in a dark hoodie and sweatpants, his hair slightly messy, eyes thoughtful in a way that felt older than his years, and Daniel forced a small smile because no matter how tired his heart felt, his son was the one thing that always brought light back into the room. "Couldn't sleep?" Daniel asked, keeping his tone easy, and Ethan shrugged, stepping closer, saying he just wasn't tired, but Daniel sensed there was more behind that answer, something unspoken and restless, so he shifted the blanket and nodded toward the couch, inviting him to sit, and Ethan did, lowering himself beside his father, not too close at first, but close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and they both faced the screen as two strangers on television argued about love and timing and mistakes. Words that seemed to echo a little too clearly in Daniel's ears. For a few minutes neither of them spoke, the rain tapping against the glass like a quiet drumbeat, and Daniel wondered if Ethan noticed how still he had become whenever scenes about marriage appeared, wondered if his son saw the flicker of regret that crossed his face before he could hide it, but Ethan kept his eyes forward, listening, thinking. And then suddenly he reached for the remote and muted the TV, the sudden silence filling the room so completely that Daniel's breath felt louder than it should, and he turned slowly, surprised, meeting his son's serious gaze. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice steady but soft, "do you still love Mom?" And the question landed between them like something fragile and heavy at the same time, catching Daniel off guard because they had talked about school, about friends, about college plans, but rarely about the heart of what had changed their family, and for a moment Daniel didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because he did, and the truth was layered and complicated, and he saw in Ethan's eyes not accusation but confusion, maybe even fear, as if understanding his parents' story was somehow tied to his own future. Daniel swallowed and looked down at his hands, noticing how tightly they were clasped, and he forced them to relax, reminding himself that his son deserved honesty, not a polished version of the past. And as he searched for the right words he realized how much time had passed since anyone had asked him that question directly, how he had buried his feelings under routine and responsibility, focusing on being a steady father while ignoring the quiet loneliness that lingered after midnight. Ethan shifted slightly, drawing his knees up and resting his arms on them, and Daniel saw that this wasn't a casual curiosity but something deeper, something that had been building inside him. And before Daniel could speak, Ethan added in a low voice, "Because I think I'm starting to understand what love really means, and it scares me," and those words changed everything, because now Daniel understood that this wasn't just about his mother, it was about Ethan standing at the edge of his own emotional world, unsure and hopeful at the same time. Daniel felt a sudden rush of protectiveness mixed with tenderness, realizing his son was no longer a child asking simple questions but a young man trying to make sense of feelings that felt bigger than himself, and he noticed how the rain outside had grown steadier, almost as if the world had narrowed to this living room, this couch, this quiet conversation that neither of them had planned but both needed. Daniel turned fully toward Ethan, giving him his full attention, and in that moment the movie, the phone, the rest of the world faded away, because this was the kind of moment that shaped lives. The kind that could either build walls or build trust, and Daniel chose trust, even though it meant opening doors he had kept closed. He saw the tension in Ethan's jaw, the way his fingers twisted the edge of his sleeve, and he remembered being 16 himself, remembering how intense first feelings could be, how love could feel like both a promise and a risk, and he realized that tonight wasn't just about looking back at a marriage that had ended. It was about guiding his son towards something that had not yet begun. The room felt smaller but warmer, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen mixing with the rain's rhythm, and Daniel finally drew in a slow breath, knowing that whatever he said next would matter more than he could fully measure, and as he opened his mouth to answer, he understood that this quiet evening, which had started as another lonely night in front of Netflix, had quietly turned into a turning point for both of them. Because sometimes love does not announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic scenes, sometimes it sits beside you on a couch, asks a simple question, and waits for an honest answer that can change everything. Daniel let out a slow breath and leaned back against the couch, his eyes moving from the dark television screen to Ethan's face, and he knew this was one of those moments when a father's words could either close a door or gently open one, so he chose honesty wrapped in calm. And he said quietly that love does not simply vanish like a light switched off. It changes, it shifts, it sometimes grows softer and sometimes grows distant, but it leaves a mark that never fully fades. And Ethan listened without interrupting, his young face serious in a way that made Daniel realize how quickly time had moved, because just yesterday it felt like he was teaching him how to ride a bike, and now they were sitting here talking about the weight of the heart. Daniel admitted that he did not hate Ethan's mother, that he respected her and cared about her as the woman who helped build their family, but that somewhere along the way they had stopped understanding each other, and Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly at that, as if he had been holding on to a fear that anger lived between his parents, and Daniel continued, explaining that love needs attention the way plants need water, that without listening, patience, and small daily kindness, even strong feelings can grow tired. And Ethan stared at the floor, absorbing every word, then finally spoke in a voice that carried both hope and worry, saying there was someone he liked, someone who made his heart race in ways he did not fully understand, and Daniel felt a quiet smile rise inside him because this was the real reason behind the question. Ethan hesitated before saying her name was Lily, a girl from his literature class who loved poetry and talked about traveling someday to New York or maybe Montreal, someone who laughed freely and looked at him like he mattered. And as he described her, his eyes brightened in a way Daniel had not seen before, and Daniel realized that this was the beginning of something tender and fragile, the first chapter of a story Ethan did not yet know how to write. Ethan confessed that when Lily brushed past him in the hallway or asked for help with homework, his chest felt tight and light at the same time, and he could not tell if it was excitement or fear, and Daniel remembered that feeling clearly, the mix of courage and doubt that love can bring, and he nodded slowly, encouraging him to continue. Ethan admitted he was scared of saying the wrong thing, scared she might not feel the same way, scared of becoming just another boy in her memory, and Daniel saw that this was not about teenage drama but about self-worth, about wondering if he was enough, and Daniel felt a deep ache because he had once asked himself that same question in his own marriage, wondering if working longer hours and trying harder to provide would somehow prove his love, not realizing that presence and attention mattered more than anything money could buy. The rain outside softened to a gentle whisper as Daniel explained that love is not about being perfect, it is about being real, about showing someone who you truly are and allowing them to decide if they value that. And Ethan listened carefully, his fingers still twisting the sleeve of his hoodie, and asked in a low voice what happens if two people care but still drift apart, and Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully, saying that sometimes people grow in different directions, that it does not mean the love was fake, only that life is complex and timing can be cruel. And Ethan's eyes searched his father's face as if trying to measure the truth there. Daniel admitted that he and Ethan's mother had good years, full of laughter and shared dreams, but they stopped talking about their fears, stopped asking how the other was truly feeling, and little by little silence built walls neither of them noticed until it was too late, and Ethan swallowed, taking that in as a quiet warning. He confessed that he did not want to repeat mistakes he did not fully understand, that he wanted to treat Lily with care but did not know how to begin, and Daniel felt pride rise in him because his son was not chasing attention or approval, he was thinking about responsibility and respect, and Daniel placed a steady hand on his shoulder, telling him that the first step is honesty, simple and kind, saying how you feel without pressure. Without trying to control the outcome, Ethan nodded but his voice trembled when he asked what if she does not feel the same way, what if he risks his heart and it comes back bruised, and Daniel looked at him with calm eyes and said that heartbreak is painful but it does not define you, that loving bravely is never something to regret, and that every experience teaches strength and empathy. Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, and Daniel could see the storm inside him settling into something clearer, not perfect but steadier, and in that quiet living room filled with soft shadows and the fading sound of rain, father and son were no longer separated by age but connected by something deeper, the shared understanding that love is powerful and unpredictable, that it can bring joy and sorrow, but it is always worth approaching with courage. Ethan finally leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling, and admitted that he had almost decided not to tell Lily how he felt, that he thought staying silent would protect him, but now he was not so sure. And Daniel smiled gently, telling him that silence rarely protects the heart, it only delays the truth, and as the words settled between them, Ethan's expression shifted from fear to determination, not because he suddenly had all the answers, but because he felt supported, and Daniel realized that this conversation was not just guiding his son toward first love, it was also healing parts of his own heart that had stayed guarded for too long. And as the room grew still and the night deepened, both of them understood that something important had changed, that this was more than a casual talk during a movie. It was the moment Ethan began to see love as something serious and beautiful, and Daniel began to see that even after loss, the lessons of the past could light the path forward. Daniel stayed quiet for a long moment after Ethan's last question, feeling the weight of the past press gently against his chest. And he understood that this was the point where he could either give safe, simple advice or open the deeper truth. So he chose the truth, telling his son that when he first met Ethan's mother he believed love was built on big gestures, surprise trips, long drives with music playing, late-night talks about dreams and future plans, and for a while it felt magical and strong. But over time he began to think that working longer hours and chasing promotions was another way of loving, convincing himself that providing comfort and security would be enough, and as he spoke he realized how clearly he could now see the small cracks that had once seemed invisible. He explained that love does not usually break in one loud moment, it fades in quiet ways, in missed conversations, in choosing your phone over eye contact, in assuming the other person will always understand without being told. And Ethan listened closely, his face serious and focused, as if he were memorizing every word. Daniel admitted that he had stopped asking his wife how she truly felt, not because he did not care, but because he was tired and distracted and certain that tomorrow would always give him another chance. And tomorrow kept coming until one day it did not feel the same, until the laughter became rare and the house felt divided even when they were in the same room, and Ethan's eyes softened as he imagined that slow distance growing between two people who once held hands without effort. Daniel said he wished he had noticed sooner, wished he had paused work emails to sit longer at the dinner table, wished he had listened without trying to fix everything, and he made it clear that love is not about solving problems quickly but about being present through them, about letting the other person feel seen and valued. Ethan shifted closer, absorbing the confession, and asked quietly if his father regretted how things ended, and Daniel answered honestly that he regretted not fighting harder before the silence grew too wide, that he regretted assuming love would survive without care, but he did not regret loving at all, because even though the marriage ended, the love created Ethan, and That alone made it meaningful. Ethan looked down at his hands and admitted he was afraid of making similar mistakes, afraid that he might one day hurt someone without realizing it, and Daniel gently told him that fear can guide you if you listen to it, that awareness is already a step toward doing better. He explained that real love is not about impressing someone every day, it is about consistency, about small acts like checking in after a hard day, remembering important details, apologizing quickly when you are wrong, and choosing to stay in uncomfortable conversations instead of walking away. Ethan nodded slowly, picturing Lily's smile, her bright eyes when she talked about books and future plans, and he confessed that sometimes when she spoke he felt so overwhelmed by how much he liked her that he stayed quiet, worried he might say something foolish, and Daniel smiled gently, saying that honesty, even when awkward, builds stronger bridges than silence ever could. He told Ethan that vulnerability is not weakness, that saying I like you or I care about you might feel risky but it shows courage, and courage is what gives love a real chance. The rain outside had almost stopped now, leaving only the soft drip from the roof, and the room felt calm, as if the storm had passed both outside and within them. Daniel admitted that if he could go back in time he would spend less energy trying to appear strong and more time admitting when he felt unsure or afraid, because pretending to have all the answers creates distance, while sharing doubts invites closeness. And Ethan listened with a new understanding, seeing his father not just as a parent but as a man who had loved deeply and learned painful lessons. He asked if love always has to hurt to matter, and Daniel shook his head, saying pain is not the goal, growth is, and sometimes growth comes through challenges, but healthy love should feel safe, supportive, and encouraging most of the time. Ethan's shoulders relaxed as if a heavy weight had been lifted, and he admitted that he wanted to be the kind of person Lily could trust, someone steady and kind, and Daniel told him that becoming that person starts now, not when she says yes, but in how he treats others every day. He reminded him that respect, patience, and listening are not dramatic acts, yet they are the foundation of something lasting. Ethan looked at his father with gratitude in his eyes and asked softly if he thought it was too late for second chances in life, and Daniel paused, feeling that question reached deeper than it first appeared, because it was not just about Ethan's future but his own, and he answered that it is never too late to grow, never too late to love differently, even if the shape of love changes. He admitted he had spent a long time defining himself by the end of his marriage, believing failure told the whole story, but sitting here guiding his son made him realize that lessons passed forward are also a form of redemption. Ethan gave a small, thoughtful smile and said he did not see his father as someone who failed, he saw him as someone who cared enough to learn, and those words struck Daniel in a way he did not expect, filling his chest with a quiet warmth. The television screen remained dark, forgotten, and the room that once felt heavy now carried a sense of closeness and understanding. Daniel placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder once more and told him that love is not about never making mistakes, it is about correcting them with humility and choosing every day to stay present. And Ethan nodded with determination, no longer just a nervous teenager but a young man beginning to understand that love requires effort and bravery. In that simple living room, without dramatic music or grand speeches, a father passed down the most honest part of his story, not polished or perfect, but real, and as the night settled gently around them, both of them felt that something important had shifted, that the past no longer felt like a shadow but like a guide, and that the future, though uncertain, held room for wiser, stronger love built on the lessons of yesterday. The room felt different now, lighter, as if the long conversation had opened a window no one knew was closed, and Ethan leaned back against the couch with a quiet strength in his eyes, no longer confused but thoughtful. And he admitted that he had planned to ask Lily to the winter dance at school but almost changed his mind that very morning because fear had whispered that rejection would be too embarrassing, too painful, too final. And Daniel listened carefully before telling him that fear often sounds louder than hope but rarely tells the full truth, that courage is not about being certain of the outcome but about being willing to step forward anyway. Ethan nodded slowly, imagining himself walking up to Lily by her locker, hearing the buzz of students around them, feeling his heartbeat race, yet this time not turning away. And Daniel could almost see that scene play out in his son's mind, the nervous smile, the simple honest words, the chance of something beautiful beginning. He reminded Ethan that no answer could take away his value, that whether she said yes or needed time or even said no, he would still be the same kind, thoughtful young man sitting beside him tonight, and that love should never shrink a person's worth. Ethan absorbed that truth deeply, then surprised his father by asking if he ever thought about loving someone again, not replacing the past but starting something new. And Daniel felt a quiet pause inside himself because he had avoided that thought for so long, telling himself he was too busy, too cautious, too set in his routine, yet hearing the question from his son made it feel less frightening and more possible. He admitted that part of him had built walls after the divorce, not out of anger but out of protection, convincing himself that staying alone was safer than risking disappointment again. But he also confessed that safety is not the same as happiness, and Ethan gave him a small encouraging smile that carried more maturity than his years. The rain had fully stopped now, leaving only the glow of streetlights reflecting off wet pavement outside, and the apartment felt warm in a steady, peaceful way. Ethan stood up slowly, then paused, looking back at his father as if memorizing the moment. And he said softly that he did not want his parents' story to be the only example of love he carried. He wanted to believe in second chances, in growth, in doing things better. And Daniel felt pride rise in his chest because that belief meant his son had not become cynical or closed off but hopeful and brave. He told Ethan that every generation gets the chance to improve on the last, that wisdom is not about avoiding mistakes entirely but about learning from those who walked before you. And Ethan nodded with determination, saying he would ask Lily to the dance on Monday, no matter how nervous he felt, because silence would only leave him wondering what could have been. Daniel smiled, seeing not just a teenager with a crush but a young man ready to take emotional responsibility for his own heart, and as Ethan walked toward the hallway he turned back once more and said, almost casually yet deeply sincere, "Dad, I think you deserve another chance too." And those words stayed in the air long after he disappeared into his room. Daniel remained on the couch, staring at the dark television screen that now reflected his own face, and for the first time in years he did not see only regret there. He saw growth, resilience, and the quiet strength of someone who had loved, lost, and still chosen kindness. He thought about the possibility of meeting someone new someday, not rushing, not forcing it, but staying open instead of guarded, allowing conversation and connection to happen naturally, and the idea did not feel impossible anymore. The silence in the apartment no longer felt heavy but calm, like a pause between chapters rather than the end of a story. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the clean streets shining under the night sky, realizing that somewhere between a muted movie and a serious question his relationship with his son had shifted into something deeper, built on honesty and trust. He understood that while his marriage had ended, his ability to love had not. It had simply been waiting for courage to wake it again. In his room, Ethan lay awake, rehearsing the words he would say to Lily, feeling nervous yet hopeful, carrying his father's advice like a quiet compass guiding him forward. Both of them, in separate rooms under the same roof, were thinking about the future with less fear than before, and that change alone felt powerful. Daniel turned off the lights and headed toward his bedroom, pausing briefly outside Ethan's door with a small smile, grateful for the unexpected conversation that had bridged years of unspoken emotion. The night settled gently around the apartment, peaceful and full of promise, and though nothing dramatic had happened, something meaningful had begun, a renewal of belief in love, in effort, in second chances. And as father and son drifted toward sleep, each carried a new sense of courage, ready to step into their own stories with open hearts and steady hope.